Tomorrow, August 15th, marks 70 years since the start of KBS World Radio. It has stood alongside the nation as it recovered from the fallout of the Korean War, as it struggled for democracy, and as it saw rapid economic growth to become a top 10 economic power. And to mark this incredible milestone, we have prepared a special extended in-depth today for Korea 24 to look back at those 70 years and also to discuss what lies ahead, especially its role as a public international broadcaster. And to do that, we have three distinguished guests with us today. First, we have in the studio with us Dr. Kim Sang-woo, a former ambassador for international security affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade during the Kim Dae-jung administration. He was also the special advisor to the director of the National Intelligence Agency from 2000 to 2002, and he worked as former President Roh Moo-hyun's spokesperson for foreign correspondence. He sits to the left of me now. Dr. Kim, hello, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
We also have with us Michael Breen, the former Seoul correspondent for The Guardian, The Times and The Washington Times, as well as the former president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club. He is currently the CEO of Insight Communications Consultants based here in Seoul. Mr. Breen, hello and welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And we also have joining us via video call today, Christian Porter, CEO of the Public Media Alliance, a non-profit organisation founded in 1945 and the largest global association of public service media organisations. Mr. Porter, hello and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, before we start, I wanted to briefly go over the history of KBS World Radio for our listeners. So I would like to kindly ask our guests to please bear with me for a minute or so. So KBS World Radio is Korea's flagship public international broadcaster. Its maiden transmission was aired in a 50-minute English broadcast on August 15th under the station name The Voice of Free Korea. That was in 1953. It was renamed to Radio Korea in 1973 and then to KBS World Radio in 2005 in a bid to better reflect the station's increasingly globalized mission. KBS World Radio is now broadcast in 11 languages. That's English, Korean, Japanese, French, Russian, Chinese, Spanish, Indonesian, Arabic, Vietnamese and German. Its mission is to provide news and information about Korea to the world, as well as deliver Korea's stance and news on inter-Korean affairs. It's also strived to promote Korean culture and language, as well as build a bond with the 7 million Korean expatriates overseas. And finally, it's also looked to provide information for overseas Koreans in times of disaster and emergency. KBS World Radio can be accessed via local FM and AM radio in certain areas, shortwave radio, the internet, as well as mobile devices. Okay, so let me turn to our two guests now in the studio, looking back at the past 70 years and the role of KBS World Radio as a public international broadcaster. What have you made of the service? Let me start with you, Mr. Kim.
Well, I am not in a position to comment on what the KBS World Radio has been doing the past 70 years, but I would like to say that there are certain issues that can make public service broadcasting a bit more independent and impartial. To date, in Korea, the appointment of important media personnel in the public sector is under the authority of the Korean president. And this is, it does not mean that it disrupts the independence of free speech, but it does have an influence to the public service broadcasters, and it does have an influence if and when the government of the day decides to have some specific idea of how to manage editorial tone or content. And as far as I understand, the PSB journalists in Korea rejects this, and if they feel that their independence is compromised, they reject this and they protest. But there is a limit to resistance. And in order for the complete independence and free speech will depend upon the change of policy. And this has to be done through having the appointment of these high-level public sector media personalities to be more independent and partial.
Right.
Because it is very important in this day and age when there is a growing concern about fake news, about the contents online that has provided some harmful influence to younger generation people. So I think that the public service broadcasters needs to have the image that they provide correct and impartial, accurate news. And this is something that Korea needs to do. This is really up to the public opinion and the politicians to change the law so that this can be provided.
Right, the impartiality issue, it has been something that's been particularly vociferously debated in recent months, but it is a long-standing issue, and it is, of course, something that KBS World Radio needs to be mindful as well, although that issue is something that has been vociferously debated for KBS as a whole. Mr. Breen, what about you? What can you tell us about what you've seen of KBS World Radio?
Well, I think I have the advantage over not only the other guests, but everybody else in this room, that I was actually alive when it started. Although I was 1 year old, so I wasn't an avid listener. But I think, it's impossible to sort of separate. The question is a difficult one because it's impossible to separate the service from the country and the status of the country at the time. And if you look, and I'm sure Mr. Porter will tell us more about this, but I was looking recently in preparation for our session today at which countries have similar sort of public international broadcasting, and I was surprised how many. And it's in fact, almost every country, it seems, and it makes sense, they have an interest in getting their view across. But then I thought, well, what would make me want to tune in to sort of Radio Slovakia or Radio Kenya or something? And presumably I'm not the target audience. So, and I think at the beginning stages, I can imagine when it was called was it Korea Radio, the Radio for Free Korea? Yeah.
Voice of Free Korea.
Oh, the Voice of Free Korea. That the country was in a very insecure position. It was totally dependent on America. It was split in half, with the communist half having just gone to war against this half. And so had a particular need for the world to know about it and understand it and support it in a certain way. That's very, very different from, say, what the Voice of America, which is America's version of this, would be doing. So I think I'm dodging the question a little bit because I think, like Dr. Kim, I haven't been, we who live here don't listen to the international broadcast, so I haven't followed it that closely. But I think it's developed as Korea has developed. But now, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think it should adjust to the new Korea a bit more.
Mr. Porter, let me turn to you next. Can you give us a bit more of an international context into this as well? Because you are the expert, I would say, in the international public broadcasting systems. Can you perhaps tell us a bit more about the role they play and how they have evolved over the last century as well?
Sure. I suppose we need to look back to about 100 years ago. When the BBC first started broadcasting in 1922, other national broadcasters swiftly followed, like Czech Radio, which celebrates its centenary this year. But international public broadcasting didn't really emerge into sort of something fully fledged until the 1930s. It catered for those at the time, especially from the UK perspective, catering for those speaking the national language abroad, and in the outbreak of World War II, it was used to counter enemy propaganda. And I suppose, again, in the UK context, the World War II was really critical in embedding the role of national public broadcasting into the national consciousness. And the fallout from the war, more broadly, helped to emphasise the need for international presence, especially for sort of the national consciousness abroad. And it was similar to what Mr. Breen was just speaking about in South Korea. And, this was often seen as a means of a tool for soft power, showcasing a particular country's perspective on world events, to highlight its position socially, culturally, even politically. However, these organisations really evolved into something that is public broadcasting when they're empowered with those public service values that Dr. Kim was talking about, values like editorial independence, impartiality, accountability. And that's when these organisations become so much more and have become vehicles for not just delivering a perspective that might be from the national state of mind, but actually being vehicles for trusted news and information, especially in non-democratic countries or in countries that lack independent news and media freedom. So now we have many countries that have international public broadcasters like KBS World, Deutsche Welle, ABC International from Australia, Radio France International. But it's very important to make the distinction between these organisations, and especially where they have public service media values, and the international services of non-democratic regimes, which there are increasingly more of as well, which often have far greater financial resources because of their direct links to the state. So it's very important to make that distinction.
It's interesting because international public broadcasts, they face a fundamental challenge of sorts, I guess, of having to balance between serving national interests while also looking at the international public interests as well. Mr. Breen, Mr. Porter there talked about the BBC, of course, possibly, probably the most famous international public broadcaster of them all, the BBC World Service anyway. How would you say, looking at perhaps what BBC has done, how have they tried to balance between these two missions of serving national interests and international interests? Does that differ, do you think, from how KBS World Service should balance between the two interests?
Well, I think there's a slight difference. I mean, the BBC in many ways is a model and has done it very well. And as Mr. Porter was just saying, delivers, it is not simply telling international viewers and listeners about what's happening in Britain or introducing the culture and things like that. Because there was a feeling, I think, right from the start, if it started in the 20s, it meant that Britain was already known in that regard. It felt it was known. So it didn't have to build awareness in that sense. So what it's focused on instead is quality journalism, and the BBC, if you look at its charter and the agreements under which it operates, it with the World Service, it is required to get, I don't know what the word is, guidance or direction from the foreign minister, the foreign ministry. Regarding its objectives and the targets and perhaps even the languages that it's going to function in. But beyond that, it's completely independent in how it sets about fulfilling its mission. And it chooses to, I mean, other British people might argue with this, but it chooses to do so by adhering to very high standards of journalism, fairness, impartiality, independent editorial line. So it doesn't swing from, with each change of government, it doesn't sort of swing from one way to the other in any regards. And in doing so, it achieves both things. It provides news to people around the world. And interestingly, the BBC has a reputation, has had for decades, of being the broadcaster that people tune into around the world, often to find out what's happening in their country.
Right.
And if you listen to the old broadcasts, they were very straightforward, factual, objective, and sort of clear, if you like. And some BBC reporters around the world sort of became rock stars in certain countries when they were unknown in their own country. It does that, and at the same time, it's satisfying, I suppose, the taxpayer or the license payer. That's how it's done in Britain. So the British taxpayer, who's not really familiar with the World Service, frankly, but accepts this because it doesn't feel that we're foisting propaganda. It doesn't feel their money's being wasted for some kind of propaganda purpose. That would make us feel uncomfortable. We're not trying to change people, but we're delivering news that's valuable in a proper professional manner. And so I think, in the sense, both parties are satisfied.
Mr. Porter, I guess that's the main difference between the BBC and other countries' public broadcasting services, that the BBC is looking to perhaps tell people about what's going on around the world and in their own country that they're listening from as well. Whereas, for example, KBS World Radio, it's about telling the world about what's going on in Korea.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction to make. Before we speak about the balance between the two, the reporting internationally and the international services, national services, it's important to remember that these international public broadcasters, KBS World, BBC World Service, they share many of the same values. They sometimes operate separately to national broadcasters and often funded in different ways too. So I think we need to understand that in every context, every country, each public broadcaster operates in a different way, although they often share the same values, especially from democratic states. But in terms of the balancing act, I think it's vital that public broadcasters, where they can, do offer services in the international public interest. I think KBS World does do that, whilst not only just reporting in South Korea, it does the other way around as well. And, frankly, we're more connected. And I completely agree with Michael about the fact that the license fee payers do get something from the BBC World Service and from reporting internationally. But I think we need to remember that we are more connected globally than ever before. Our nations are more informed by and entwined with each other, and global events, particularly thanks to social media and other platforms and so on, more than any time in our history. So it's incredibly important that public service broadcasters are both able to inform, report, work nationally and internationally, and have this other platform of international operations. I think that's very important. And we're seeing it around the world, the importance of these services, especially in countering disinformation and misinformation abroad, providing services and news to those in less free countries. It's seen the growth of international public broadcasting. We've seen it in Australia and New Zealand with new services across the Pacific. The South African public broadcaster is launching an international service. We've seen it in Thailand and Taiwan. And I suppose where effective, this investment is an important tool in countering disinformation and misinformation. But like I said, not all international public broadcasts are the same. Some have different priorities, and some have more of an emphasis on reporting their own nation's news and current affairs internationally.
Right, and before we move on, Dr. Kim, could we also get your thoughts on the role that has been served between national interest and international public interest that KBS World Radio has played over the past 70 years?
I don't know whether I can talk about KBS Radio, World Radio, but I do know that KBS Television has played, as well as Arirang TV, has played a role in promoting public diplomacy for Korea, in a sense. And as Michael has said previously, that Korea has developed. In the past, there was not much interest from the international community concerning Korea. Maybe North Korea was more of an interest to foreigners. But with the development of Korean economy and its soft culture, and now there is an interest, because KBS was originally targeting overseas Koreans, but now the non-Korean descendants, foreigners, are interested in watching English subtitled Korean programs that KBS originally aired. I think KBS did a good job during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it had its 24-hour emergency operation going on. And the CEO of KBS then at that time said something like KBS is aiming to provide accurate news and information rather than trying to compete on fruitless news-breaking issues. So that kind of attitude and effort has enabled KBS to be selected by Koreans at that time as the most trustworthy method of gaining information during the country's lockdown. So, and that kind of way of addressing these kinds of international public interest, as well as it is also a national interest issue as well. So KBS should aim to address these kinds of issues like what we are now experiencing more and more through climate change, the various typhoons and all kinds of unpredictable weather.
Yeah.
So I think one of the issues that KBS can address is issues like climate change, which they did a good job during the COVID lockdown.
Sure. Let's look at the challenges that faces public broadcasters as well now, because the media environment has undergone significant transformations over the past 70 years, but especially in the last couple of decades as well. Changes salient with technological development, of course, digitization, the widespread adoption of the internet and emergence of platforms like YouTube. Mr. Porter, what do you think has been the most significant changes that has affected international public broadcasting, the challenges these new changes have posed?
There have been so many, especially over 70 years. I mean, you've got the birth of TV and the evolution of that, the World Wide Web, various laws and regulations that have come and gone, changes in, let's take South Korea, for example, changes in government and changes in approaches to broadcasting and the funding of the license fee and so on and so forth. But what's particularly significant in the international arena, say compared to 50 years ago, and especially in the last 20 years, is the rapid state of change. From digital transition to the rapid growth of streaming services, social media platforms, AI. It all means that audiences are fragmenting. So they're using multiple services on multiple devices, and the pressure for public broadcasters to keep pace, to be relevant and accessible all the time is immense, and to reach their mandate of reaching everyone in a nation. So social media, for example, has fundamentally changed the landscape in which public broadcasters operate, and has been a crucial tool for them to reach audiences, or for journalists when it comes to finding stories, case studies, sources, and so on. But it's also meant that public broadcasters have lost a lot of control, and I think that's particularly concerning. In some really important matters. So there was earlier this year we had the labeling debacle at Twitter, where public broadcasters were being wrongly labelled as government-funded media in many places around the world. There's been data security issues around the use of TikTok. So, public broadcasters using these third-party platforms, what does that mean for them in terms of their independence as well? Access to audiences on these platforms, that's a big challenge and constantly evolving. And with many public broadcasters, they rely on these platforms to reach. The problem with that is that when you're relying on these third-party platforms, and I think this is especially a challenge now, that you can often lose control of your of how much access audiences are getting to you. I mean, we're seeing this in Canada at the moment, where Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, are turning off news availability in response to a bill that's trying to level out the playing field for news organizations, which could have huge democratic and safety implications for Canadians who increasingly use Facebook, Instagram to access sources of news. So it's a big challenge, and I think the rate of change now is possibly the biggest challenge for public broadcasters.
Sure. Mr. Breen, you've been reporting for over 4 decades now, I believe, as well. So you've perhaps been feeling it most, I guess, experiencing it firsthand, going through these changes. What do you make of how things have changed over the last 40 years and 70 years, and how do you think that has challenged traditional media like international public broadcasting?
Well, I think what Mr. Porter just said it was a great summary of the technological changes and the ramifications. It's hard for me to separate out the public broadcaster and the for-profit media. I mean, the distinction here is the public broadcaster doesn't need to concern itself so much with profit, whereas the for-profit media are essentially businesses.
Sure.
And however, those in public broadcasting are journalists, and the trade craft of journalism has changed. You know, there's been a crisis in journalism in countries like America, where regional publications, thousands of them, have just disappeared. Journalists also behave differently. I have a friend who, a retired journalist who teaches in journalism college in America, who told me recently she was very surprised with her students that they're all kind of activists, advocates. They want to go into journalism in order to push an agenda, a political agenda. And when she tries to teach about the old-fashioned, objective, impartial journalism, checking your sources and making sure your quotes are accurate and things like that, she loses her audience. And also I notice a lot of journalists now write completely from home, or they're from their desk. That they look on Twitter, there's the quotes, there's no need to talk to anybody, you just take the quotes, you know. And you see an awful lot of repetition, copying from one another. So the standards of the profession, I think, are also being impacted. And ironically, I think public broadcasters may be isolated from that a little bit because they don't need to pursue profit. It's not such an intense situation for them from that point of view.
With that all in mind, then, let's look forward to the next 70 years, possibly. Dr. Kim, taking into account all that we've said so far about the challenges that media faces with the changes in technology, what would you like to see from the KBS World Service moving forward? How should it act and transform itself amid this situation with everything that's changing at the moment?
Well, I think that, firstly, the Korean World Radio, if that is the specific thing that we're talking about, should first decide on what it wants to portray internationally. I mean, in the past, Korea, as I said, the services were intended for Koreans living overseas. Now that Korea is being a country that of interest by foreigners, then you have to decide on whether or not you want to portray Korea issues, or you want to portray something more international, or you want to combine that. So there, you have to first make that identity more solid and clear. At the same time, we domestically, I know of the political issues that KBS faces. As a public service broadcaster, it also means that the government still has considerable influence over editorial and also this has to change in order for it to become a real public service broadcasting entity. Because if the political influence of the day affects the editorial independence, then audiences will not be able to regard KBS as a trustworthy, impartial, accurate information provider. So in that sense, some of the things that we need to address and to resolve domestically comes first, in order for KBS to identify itself as how to approach the next 70 years.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Breen, what about you? How do you think KBS World should approach the next 70 years?
Next 70 years, okay. Here's my shot. I would like to see, I think this will happen, but I'm afraid it will take longer than I would hope for. But I would like to see a certain level of confidence. You know, we in Korea, I would say, so I've been here for 40 years, and we who live here are constantly the last ones to believe how that people view, how the way people view us around the world changes.
Mm.
I mean, I remember, it doesn't seem that long ago, when you'd sort of you'd fly to an airport somewhere, you know, you'd land in Charles de Gaulle in Paris or something, and you'd see all the luggage carts had Samsung or LG ads, and you'd feel all proud. Oh, look, we're international. You know, and the fact is, this country has emerged from the back of the line globally. It's one of the phenomenal stories of the late 20th century, and it's, in my opinion, mid-flight. It's not going away. It's not. We always feel, okay, that's it, we're finished now. And however, when it comes to national PR, which is what it is in a way, we're too shy and too backward and old thinking. Oh, we should tell the people about this and about that, about our culture, how to make kimchi. No, I would like to see Korea. The world wants to hear from Korea. Korea has to offer something to the world. And I would like to see Korea confidently, like the BBC and like others that do a similar thing, Deutsche Welle, the Germans, the French, the Americans, go out and tell global news to a global audience. And drop this thing of we have to do propaganda for our own country. Do the soft power way. Become even more admired than you are now by providing a service like that. That's what I'd like to see.
And finally, Mr. Porter, what do you think international public broadcasts need to perhaps watch out for moving forward in this changing media landscape and also the political landscape as well?
That's another big question. Thank you. Just to quickly, just to go back quickly on what Dr. Kim and Mr. Breen were saying, I think they're both right. I think you know, independent public service broadcasting that is well funded, that is viable, that is accountable to the public, that is, especially those who pay its license fee, is a hallmark of democracy. It's vital. You know, that there's quality journalism that's coming from an independent source in amongst a very plural media environment where there are lots of different media outlets. You know, a public broadcaster is there to offer that place, especially in times of elections or crises and emergencies. And I think there's, you know, I think what I'd like to see from KBS and KBS World in its operations internationally is you know, a real focus on that. I think it's a, you know, not to worry so much about demonstrating what South Korea is. I think you can do that in your journalism, quality journalism, and showcasing that you can, that the organisation can do that, much like other international public broadcasters around the world. And I think that's a really important demonstration of what South Korea is as a country as well. So robust public service broadcasting is absolutely essential. But in terms of the adapting to the changes of for other international public broadcasters, I think it's adapting to the biggest challenge is adapting to the pace of change. Like I said, I think it's, you know, public and social media, for example. A lot of public broadcasters are now trying to turn away from social media because they know it's a place where, especially say with the Twitter scandals and with the rise of hate speech, etc., it's increasingly difficult to keep quality journalism alive on there. And it's also, you know, especially with the journalism and the competition for journalists as well, it's often hard to focus on in-depth pieces rather than the short, quick turnaround pieces. Some broadcasters are leaving Twitter. You know, we've seen a reduction in services from Swedish Radio, CBC Radio Canada, NPR in the US, RTBF in Belgium, the French public broadcaster in Belgium, French language, sorry, has a long-term goal to cut its links with social media altogether. That's a very long-term goal. And the reason for that is to try and assert itself in another way as a source of quality journalism. Some organisations are collaborating ever more and creating alternative spaces for discussion, for journalism. There's a public spaces incubator that's being invested in by Canadian, German, Belgian, and Swiss public broadcasters, for example. So I think it's important for all public broadcasters, especially those of international services, to be present internationally. I think it helps to counter the sources of disinformation, authoritarianism. But the big problem with social media and with the use of third-party platforms is that, public broadcasters aren't as big. They don't have the bargaining power to make sure that their voice is adequately heard or their resources and content are adequately seen in many cases. And so I think collaboration is needed most. I think, organizations with like-minded values, like international public broadcasters, should be seen to be working together a lot more to make sure that quality journalism is available internationally. And I think that is a worthy and very satisfying goal, especially for those in country, who pay the license fee, who pay their taxes towards the public broadcasters. I think that's very important. So collaboration is needed more than ever.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all our guests for answering some very big questions today. We've been speaking to Dr. Kim Sang-woo, Michael Breen and Christian Porter. Thank you once again for your time today.